Bien, bonsoir à tous et bienvenue à la plateforme de la création architecturale.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this architectural creation platform. It's a great pleasure for me today to be welcoming our friends in a particular occasion because it is our anniversary here today. It was exactly 4 years ago that we began this platform in an experimental format. This type of confrontation, a European confrontation, because we wanted it to be in Europe, between a French agency and an agency coming from somewhere else in Europe. And it has, with each time, proven with an installation that it can be very intriguing. It's interesting to see that Avignon-Clouet have proposed an enormous saw. And I could maybe interpret that as they are encouraging us to destroy the half pipe because it is a constraint, or it is the scenographers and the architects who invented this area. It's an extremely constricted place, and one day an architect is going to destroy it. And I think this is the first step, that great big saw. So we've got Avignon-Clouet, who are face-to-face this evening with Fala, who are young architects from Porto. And it's particularly interesting to take a look at these architects. They have a fascinating profile because Portugal has such an image. We love it. It is a great nation, great architecture. You have probably all gone to the Triennale in Lisbon. And in Porto, there are two Priscas that live in Porto. You've got the immense Álvaro Siza and Soto de Moura. So these young architects have a very critical attitude, not critical of their masters, because I don't think that is their intention at all, but to look at architecture slightly differently, to step out of the beaten track and step out of that well-known Portuguese vision of architecture. I have asked Ivan Blasi to be with us tonight. He is an architectural critique, but he is also he works for a foundation. He is an auctioneer in a foundation, one of the finest European prizes that can be won by an architect for a building, not for a whole career, but for a building. It was a prize that was founded in 1986, and the very first prize was given to who? It was given to a Portuguese, and who? Álvaro Siza, for a famous bank. So it is a marker, and we can see to what extent on the contemporary international stage, Portugal is extremely important. So it's with great pleasure that I'm now going to give the floor to Ivan Blasi. He is going to do this debate. It's multilingual. They're going to speak Franco-English, and we have two interpreters who are here this evening who are going to be doing this exercise of juggling from one language to another, and the different personalities inherent in these different languages. And at the end, we will have questions and answers. Ask questions and answers. Destabilize them, because the French who want to saw down our building, they need to be destabilized. Thank you very much, Francis. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you to the architectural platform and the city for having issued this invitation. I have been here several times over the last 3 or 4 years, and thank you very much to the architects who are here this evening. As Francis said, you're a very hybrid team. We've got the team from Porto, Fala, with Filipe Magalhães and Ahmed Belkhodja. We also have Luisa Soares. We are all men here this evening, but in the architectural teams there is a woman. And we also have the team from the Loire Valley, from Nantes, Avignon-Clouet, with Benjamin Avignon and Saweta Clouet. I don't know them very well. I started reading up about them after having been invited here this evening, and I think that it's going to be very fascinating to be able to listen to you speak this evening and then to ask you questions. You are architects who are producing remarkable things, but things that are very different. And you are following strategies that seem to me, at first sight, to be extremely different as well. We'll see, however, that is the first thing that we're going to see. You've got the logo here, you've got Fala on the left, and you've got Avignon-Clouet, you've got the mouse and the hammer. And I think this is one of the great characteristics, is the differences between these two architectural agencies and how they communicate extremely differently. So I think with them, there's a new way of understanding, of doing, and of communicating. Now, I would like to divide up this evening's debate into 4 parts. The first part is to get to know them better, to see exactly how they work, and the second part will deal with communications. How do they draw? How do they participate? And then we'll take a look at some of their concrete projects. And the last part, the 4th part, will be the question and answer session this evening. So to begin with the very first part, for Avignon-Clouet, your agency emerged at the beginning of the 1970s. Or you were born, at the beginning of the 1970s, and you founded your architectural cabinet in 2000 in Nantes, whereas Fala, you were born at the end of the 80s, and you founded your office in 2013 in Porto. Avignon-Clouet used your family name to designate their agency, whereas Fala used the word Fala, which means to speak, the capacity to say words, and it's also the initials of their names. Avignon-Clouet uses the word architects in French, whereas you use the French word atelier, which leaves a lot of scope for imagination and interpretation. The partners of Avignon-Clouet studied in Nantes, that's where you graduated, and Fala, you studied in Porto, Ljubljana, Tokyo, Zurich, Lausanne, Göteborg, Singapore, and you've worked in Japan and in Switzerland before actually creating your own atelier. So one could say already that there are extreme differences between you both, differences in the way in which you submerge yourselves in architecture, and between the way in which you consider architecture today. Let's see if there are any common denominators between you. To begin, I'd like to ask Fala, please. Tell us something about this image behind you. What does that mean?
A long, long time ago, in what feels to be a galaxy far away, me and Anna had a chance to work in Japan. Ahmed had already worked in Japan, and because we are what we like to call architecture geeks, we go to all of these sacred monsters, to all of these buildings, to knock on the door, to try to enter, and so on. And we were having a lot of trouble to enter in the Nakajin Capsule Tower from Kurokawa. So we actually invented a lie, and we said we were looking for an apartment to rent, so that they could at least show us one. And we actually rented an apartment that night. So we achieved 2 objectives. The one we wanted, to see the building, and the second we didn't know we wanted, which was to live there. And then the really interesting part is that we had the opportunity to live there for 1 year. Me and Anna in 8 square meters. It was quite intense. And it somehow triggered a series of, I would call it research projects and utopias and debates. And we interviewed the few surviving residents. We, because of that, met a lot of very interesting people in the process, editors, other fellow architects, and so on. So it was a kind of one of those jokes that became a very important step for our beginning as a practice.
Is Saweta Benjamin?
And Benjamin, what does this image mean for you? Is that where you started? Where you're working today? Is that your office? Or not? Yes, it is the place where we work, but that's not at all where we started out. It's a singular building because you're in naval shipbuilding yards, and it was a former brasserie, a brewery, so it's good, it suits us. It's got water and it's got beer. It's perfect. It's a little gem, actually. There are all sorts of different seed companies, startup companies, all doing different things. So it's extremely encouraging for us all. And we've had some partnerships as well, where we got in touch with some of the companies who are working here, the shipyards, for example, who are working with us on the project that is a Japanese project, the Shishi-Odushi house. And we worked this technology. We will use the local technology. So we're simply making the most of the people who are in this building with us. And how did you begin? How did you think of starting your agency? What was your first project? We started working under his staircase. Under his staircase, there was 1 square meter, just enough room for one computer. 2 of us worked on one computer. It was a minimum amount of space, minimum profitability, maximum profitability, of course. That's where we started, under my staircase. We met each other per chance. I was doing some intern work there, and he was there as well, doing some work for them as well, and I suggested that we should work together, work more to earn more, and we entered a competition. We won the competition, and that's how we started. We didn't have an office, we didn't have an agency, we didn't have a worker's status. It was lucky that we won that competition. So we started out working under a staircase, and then we had a small agency in Nantes, in a somewhat provocative area of Nantes, and then we found this area, which wasn't too expensive. The premises themselves are not really fundamental. That it's not a space that is representative of us. We do welcome our clients there, but it's a little bit as if we were welcoming them into our home. It's just a workspace, that's all. But it is a place that resembles us. When people come into these premises, they can see what we're working on the tables, the prototypes, the models. So it's a type of apparent reality and truth. Before you began to work, these 2 schools of architecture in Nantes and Porto were schools that had international influence. And at a given time, one could say that they were operating in areas that might have been considered somewhat peripheral. But at the same time, Nantes and Porto are towns that communicate a lot. They have harbors, they have ports, they communicate internationally. I wanted to ask Avignon-Clouet, what type of influence has the architecture from Porto had on your studies, this type of architecture? Did it have an influence on you? Well, I think that what's important is to actually experience what is real, to see things in actual life, to travel, to go and see these places. That's how we conceive of architecture, rather than looking at what other architectures do. Of course, we do go and look at what other architects do, but I think the first thing that's important is the first impression you get of material, of sensations, of space, of the environment, of humidity, of heat, of cold. So here you've got the beach, you've got the rocks, you've got the little caves in the rocks. That is the beginning of an architectural sensation. That's your first introduction to architecture. Actually, after this, we had quite a few projects where we thought of swimming pools, of designing swimming pools, La Rosisa, which isn't bad. I think it's good, but we have a lot of projects with swimming pools, and the swimming pools are always somewhat unusual. At the beginning, that was not necessarily something that was in the client's order, but afterwards they've become a key element of the architectural design. Whereas actually in the specifications, it was more, are we going to have enough money to be able to put in a swimming pool? And then afterwards it's become a key feature. But in architecture, there are some things, the things that interest you and what the Fala does as well. I'm going to begin asking questions between yourselves, between the 2 teams, for example. I'm very impressed by Caesar, but I'd like to come back to what you just said. I've never actually lived through the Caesar's exceptionality, the minimalist or the type of minimalist landscaping. I've never actually seen them in real life. Well, I've been 4 times to Porto. I've seen Caesar 4 times, but as Saweta says, our models are not necessarily architectural ones. We've travelled. We've been to the south of the Loire Valley in France. We've been to the west in the Vendée in France. So, of course, we're interested in architectural culture, but we do try to take in all of the culture that we see. We don't necessarily have one architectural model. I think that there is quite a clear difference. These references, these architects, Cézanne, I think that these are common riches, that common property, joint property, if you like, that we all have in our offices. Everybody working for us has been trained differently. We come from different cultures, and our common denominator is architecture. And of course, the real world and sensorial experiences play a role in what we produce. But what allows us to actually speak a common language is largely due to the fact that we share common references. The problem of having references, of course, is that often they are very distanced from each other. So you have to work at using them together. The A80 Salles, actually just last week I was there. I actually rang the doorbell to try and get in, and there was no reply. So the beginning of this work is something that fascinates us.
2 seconds delay. No, I would say that I don't want to call it an academic perspective, but I would say, yeah, maybe the way how we see architecture starts from a more academic perspective, because we see these small elements, not just the experience of the building, but the way how the plan of the building is drawn, how the building was photographed, how it was described by the architect, how it was described by third parties, as almost as relevant experiences in the building itself as the visiting of the body of the construction. So, as Ahmed said, it's true that everyone in our practice comes from very different latitudes, from different geographies, but let's say the obsessions we share with some, of course, some names more than others. Seas is naturally one of them. Shinohara, Peter Markley. I mean, there's probably 1 million of them, but they become the kind of common denominator. They become the magnets that bring us together. And in a way, we many times like to say that we are just repeating them, that we are somehow just gloriously repeating the best way we can the heroes that preceded us. And many times, as I said in the beginning, it becomes a kind of academic architecture in that sense. Maybe because we are a very young office, this is also more present, but we still see the architecture produced not inhabited. We still see it as a kind of theoretical exercise many times. Also a lot because of the context in which we work at this moment. That is a very, specific one, but it is an academic architecture in a certain sense. It's less of it's less about the genius loci, and it's much more about the theory and the rhetoric behind it.
Bon, je veux vous poser 3 questions.
I'd like to ask you 3 questions on 3 themes that are very topical and they play a very important role in architecture. They are enormous subjects. It's not easy to cover them all with the time that we have. But one of these themes is climate change and the climate challenge. I don't want your opinion on climate change itself, but how do you actually embrace this challenge in your projects, in your daily life, or when you do your projects themselves, when you design? I'm against. Well, at the scale at which we work in a local environment. Perhaps I can enlarge your question, make it more contextual. It's not just a question of climate change, but when somebody proposes something to us, we go and analyze the surrounding environment. We have a lot of experience in that, so it's completely different from what Fala has just said, because for me, and I say this to my students as well, for me, there is no reference. You can't have a reference if you haven't lived it. There's no point. If somebody has to tell you a story, that is a filter. It's an obstacle, and it's even more true in architecture. A space that hasn't been lived cannot be known. It could be done by a poet or a guitarist or a writer. When you haven't actually lived it and felt it yourself, when you haven't felt the weight of the material, when you haven't looked at the scale relationship of a building to light, you can be the most wonderful poet in the world, but if you haven't actually seen it, there is nothing stronger than what is real. So, getting back to the issue of the environment, there are two possibilities. Either the environment has certain intrinsic qualities and we just want to reveal those intrinsic qualities, or it's a horrible environment, it's a repulsive one, and then either we invent another environment or we install another one, which means we're in direct conflict with that environment. It's not easy. Sometimes we've gone into horrible environments and we have made or manufactured an environment that has a brighter sun or a better quality of life. So that's what we do, but it's rarely we ourselves. We just go into that, we infiltrate that, if you like, and either we reveal what's already there. We've an example that is called the all-out house, where the context was extraordinary, and this house was a bit like a reception room. Everything was there. We have another project called the Penthouse House, which is perched above a town, and we did all of these projects so that the ceiling never touched the ground, for example. We're absolutely immersed in that. We structured our our buildings systems. And sometimes we're in other contexts where other architects refuse to go. The little suburban pavilions, I mean, all of us hate that. We like going into some of those types of environments as well, because it's one of the responsibilities of architects. And it can be wonderful working in these little pavilion zones. If the context is not good, then we're going to try to make it good, to convert it so that it becomes better than it was. So for you, the context is either good or bad. Are you never indifferent? No, we are rarely indifferent. Ethically, we're not allowed to be indifferent. For a client, the architect has to have an opinion. The architect is not just absolutely smooth. He has to have an opinion and maybe go above and beyond the client's request. I ask that because you could have an opinion without actually having a value judgment. An environment can be either very bad or very admirable. No, it's not that black and white. It was a little bit how it was presented. There are some things, I mean, we could go into this in detail, but you've got the financial context, the landscape, you've got the neighbors, you've got trees, you've got animals. There are all sorts of things, positive and negative elements in these environments. but we are in an artistic posture. We have to react. We are players who are imagining, or actors who are reacting to something that we don't like or that we're going to have to adapt to. And in all of these situations, there are positive and negative elements. I'm just wondering, does your project always stem from the context? Yes, it does. Well, then maybe there's a difference between the way you work and the way we work. Of course, context is important to us, but it's not the only white page. Yeah, we're talking about the context in the wider sense of the term. Yes, but we have, for us, the white page that we're going to draw on is just as important as what we see when we go on site. We think that the fact that you have these two different planes that we're working on is very fertile. Well, what's your starting point? Well, yes, of course, there is a context and we have to react to it. And our project is largely a reaction to the context. And later on I'll show you what I mean. But the fact of drawing, the actual composition, the design is extremely important for us. And those two things are never in complete harmony. We've given up on the idea that they could ever be in complete harmony. And finally, the friction that we find between the two is very fruitful for us in some projects. Getting back to the environment for us is something that's very vast. I don't try to come up with exemplary designs. I don't think that a project should be exemplary. It's going to depend on the rapport that you have with the client, for example.
I mean, when this, in the last couple of years, a lot of people have been talking about climate, mostly people that don't know a lot about climate change. But I would say that as a practice, we don't think about it, honestly. To be 100% precise, we never discussed it in the office. It's not a topic that attracts us. It's not a topic that we feel engaged with. It's not a topic that influences in any way, shape or form our architecture. If there's a thing that we are many times criticized for, and I understand why, we don't change that, but we understand why, is the fact that we, to a certain extent, consider ourselves completely apolitical. Like we have zero political interest in the projects we do, and even more in the context in which we operate now. It's a very gentrified context. It's very fast. It's very aggressive, I would say. And we understood, maybe as a defense mechanism, that it's not our role to question it and to try to fight it. It's not our role to be left or right wing. It's not our role to be conservative or whatever the opposite is, progressist. It's our role. And it's our ambition, it's our, it's the motivation, it's the thing that makes us smile and fight and discuss a lot in the office, in a good way, discuss in a good way, to produce architecture. And we have a sense of joy, and I would like to end a bad answer, which is we don't care, with a positive note, that is, we love architecture. The architecture with capital A, the architecture of Bramante, the architecture of Corbusier, the architecture of Lacaton-Vassal, the architecture of 1,000 other architects. And we many times like to do architecture out of that architecture. We like to invent our architecture, and we like our architecture to be about it, not to be about saving the world, not to be about changing whatever the climate change discussion is on. And so maybe this creates a very criticizable position. Maybe this makes us seem like egocentric monsters that just care about our belly. Well, maybe that's it, if that's a perspective.
Mais en tout cas, quand vous décidez sur les matériaux, par exemple...
But when you decide on your choice of materials to use, for example, or whether the buildings can be recycled, or what type of stone, what type of marble. There must be a decision that to use material. You know that it's going to be there for many years. Yes, of course, we always we take material from local suppliers. I think that if we were to give marks in ecology, if we were to be given scores, I think we'd pass. We wouldn't fail. But it's just not something that is what we really discuss on a day-to-day basis in the office. But you do think about the people who are going to live there and the conditions that they're going to live in, and the best quality of life. Yes, we do, but we're more interested in talking about the climate in the house, for example. How does the seating system work, for example, or the environment in the larger sense. We often invent context when we talk about architecture. We have certain anchor points in a project which might not always be something that is common to the place where we're going to be building this building. So I think the environment surrounding a project is much larger for us.
I would like to add two things. If there's things we don't react to, and as I said before, climate change is probably one of them, there are things we have to react to quite often. And maybe the figure of the client, the promoter, many times we work with, is something we have to react to, and we question it. Maybe not from a political standpoint, but from a very human, and I would even say commercial standpoint. The budgets we work with, they are something we are also, we need to be very creative and do the nice, naive talk about it and how beautiful it is to work with little budgets, but also to be very pragmatic in criticizing the problems they create and not in the projects we do. The heritage system in which we work, which is in itself a new business, a new kind of nature, I would say, a new kind of, how do you call it, reality that we have to react to a lot. And in Porto, one of the projects, I suppose you will show later, also addresses that very, very directly. So the fact that we consider ourselves to be, to a certain extent, apolitical, and that we consider ourselves not to react, for example, to climate change, doesn't mean that there are not 100 other realities that we have to react a lot to. And maybe it's not about either or, maybe it's just about the frequency or the weight that these things have in our production, and they end up molding us, and the lack of weight that some other realities have in our production, and end up not affecting us at all.
Mais c'est intéressant en même temps que vous parlez de réaction, pas de...
It's very interesting because you're talking about reacting, not proactive, but reaction. Is that what you're doing? You're replying to your outside stimuli? No, I don't think so. I think that we can also be an actor. We're not just always reacting. If an architect is proposing an idea or proposing something that is new, that is an action. Artistically speaking, reaction is that something already exists that makes you react. And we're a little different. Well, for me, I think design always starts from an opinion. When I am looking at a project, I have an opinion as to what I'm seeing, and it's based on that opinion that I will develop my story and my architectural design. That's why we're different on every project. We don't want to be systematic and have reflexes that are the same every time. We don't want to have to carry the weight of heritage. Heritage for us is something that is abstract. You've got architects. Architects have built all throughout time, but we're apolitical as well. We are not left nor right. We do architecture because it pleases us. It's a question of pleasure. So there are two things. It starts from an opinion, a point of view, and secondly, from a movement of pleasure. We have to understand that doing this, drawing this, is going to give rise to pleasure, and it's going to we're extremely careful not to have automatic reflexes when we're asked to do something. We want to draw a story, to tell a story in our architecture. And maybe where we're similar with Fala is that if it's a question of the drawing or 3D or prototype houses or photography, or there are all sorts of things that are going to be grafted onto the truth of what your original opinion was. It's a bit like a self-analysis, a self-assessment. And then afterwards, there is a system. You have to hone it down. You have to make choices. You have to make selections. There's a lot of intense work, but we produce a lot of things so that we can check that there are a lot of little truths that are absolutely precise. We have tiny little truths, and we adopt those truths to defend our story, the story that we're telling. And then we might defragment all of this, and all of these little truths, we might suddenly deconstruct them and then reconstruct them again to try to tell another story. But again, so that we are forever in a momentum that is extremely pleasurable. You have to enjoy what you do, and the client is also going to be appropriating what you do. He's going to be adopting it as his own, and the client becomes a true partner. Well, I think that maybe afterwards, with the public, we're going to be having some questions asked on this. But the other thing that I'd like to ask you about is even more abstract. What about, well, this is something that I'm very personally interested in, the European identity. What about that? We are in the process of building Europe. We have been since the end of the Second World War, but we are still building it today. But we're in a world today that is overridden with populism and governments or situations that are attacking governmental values. And I wanted to ask you, what role can architecture play in that European construction? Maybe I already know the answer that you're going to give me, but do you think that architecture has a role to play in the construction of Europe? As a society, as a culture? No, I think it's the culture that has a general role to play. I'm Swiss myself, but if you have a Swiss architect, a Portuguese architect, or a Scandinavian architect, we all sort of speak the same language. We spend a lot of our time talking about architecture. It might be American, it might be European, but also Japanese or Scandinavian. We have an office that is international, people who've come from all over the world, from the depths of Siberia even. So architecture is our common language. It is our Esperanto. Well, that is what we share. It is our common good. And architecture, because it is something that we all hold to heart, is even wider, bigger than Europe. It's true that we have some clients who come from outside Europe. But I don't think that architecture can actually be used as a symbol in the construction of Europe. How can I put this? I don't quite know what role architecture plays in the construction of Europe, but at least it is something that is owned by Europe. It is a common European good. Any other opinions? Well, I think it's more the role of the architect. The role of the architect is fundamental. there would be no society that will continue to survive in the future if there is no design. Design is at the heart of any society, at any level of society. And for spaces, there is no better expert than an architect. We are experts of space. We are experts of towns, and that's what we try to defend every day. And every day we are being undermined because we are being told that we have to paint this building this color, for example. But we are experts in urban spaces and towns and lighting. That's what we have to defend. And we also have to defend the beauty of design. Generally speaking, there can be no humanity without design. We know that. Without conception. Yes, but that's a European experience. But internationally, does the architect play the same role everywhere around the world? Yes, I think so. The role of architects are the same the world over. I don't see why it would be different in one continent than from another. And it's true, the architect is an expert. The architect does a lot of good to towns and all the spaces where we live. I don't see why it would specifically be limited just to Europe.
Is it that bad if this European identity somehow dissolves and becomes something else? I don't know.
But that's. Yeah.
I'm just saying that we, at least Ahmed said like 3 times the word Japan already and America. It's not European, it's still good. Because we have this idea that if European identity disappears, it becomes something bad. We go back to the Middle Ages. I don't know. Maybe it evolves. Maybe it doesn't change. It just evolves to become something else. The same way architecture evolved, the same way, languages evolved. Maybe it's just about that. There's maybe too much of a black and white vision on this climate change and European discussions. There's very much of a polarizing aspect to it. And naturally, because it's a very political matter, it becomes polarized easily. But I think there's maybe a gray zone in the middle where this evolves to become something else. And while we discuss, it just naturally grows. And one day we stop talking about it and it's there, whatever is going to happen. But I don't see architecture per se as the engine of any kind of transformation. It's just one of 1 million actors in the process, going somewhere.
D'accord, on va changer maintenant.
All right, let's change, let's move on, let's go to leisure, football. Now, architects, do you do architecture 24 hours a day? We wonder sometimes. What are your passions? What are your obsessions? Because sometimes we see how you work, we see how you draw, but it's also very nice to see who you are.
Football with friends on Wednesdays, but today I'm here. But they found a replacement, so it's okay. No, I'm actually very biased because I'm an architect. My best friends are architects. My wife is an architect that is a partner with me in an architecture practice. We most of the times travel to see architecture. Like today I had a chance to travel around Paris and I saw 4 buildings of other architects. So yeah, it is a bit of an obsession. There are a few, personally, now I'm not answering as a practice, I'm answering as an individual. There are a few things I like to do a lot. There's a lot of, I truly love trashy 80s music, but I don't see it even, in my life scale. It's a very small grain of sand, and architecture takes, but as I said before, we are a bit of geeks in that sense. And we don't have kids yet, so it's my...
Yeah, is it... yeah, again, I'm trying not to make it a personal answer either.
Your answer is the same as mine. Just go for it.
Yeah, it's very similar in many ways. With wider tastes in music.
Non, moi je fais pas de foot, je ne vais pas au match.
Well, I don't play football. I don't even go to football matches. But I am obsessed with architecture. Now, luckily, I do have some escape hatches. I have moments when I can think about other things. I don't do a lot of sports, I have to admit. I tend to be a handyman. I'm always out there gardening, fiddling about. I like working with things, working with material. I like working with my hands, just to maybe clear my mind a bit. All right, now let's take a look at some of your work. And following on in the tradition of a lot of European offices, you began your professional careers but by transforming certain things. Avignon-Clouet with a mini loft of 34 square meters in 2001, and Fala renovating apartments in Lisbon in 2014. And one of the most interesting things that you can note when you look at the work that you've done is your desire to understand the limits and the constraints that might exist, any types, to think out of the box, to design better, and to come up with buildings that are sophisticated and a paradox. I wanted to ask Fala, when I first saw your drawings and your work, the first thing that I thought was, I thought of the house in Venturi, with that house that Venturi and Scott Brown did for Robert's mother. And there is something in here that makes me think about your interiors as well, the construction of the interior, the design of the decision concerning, or the choice of furniture. What type of relations do you have with Venturi, with the postmodernist architects? And is there any link with the work that you do? Venturi is a hero for us. We particularly like this house, and we're lucky enough to have been able to visit it. The possibility of having a popular culture and also a different culture means that in a project like this, you don't see a distinction between the two, and that's one of the things that we like so much about Venturi. This is a space that, when you look at it at first glance, it seems very ordinary, but then afterwards you realize that there is much more to understand, and we appreciate that. It's just one point of reference for us amongst many others, but and one of the saving grace of the obsession that we have with architecture is that we're very interested in lots of different types of architecture. But is that why you choose the furniture yourself every time? Well, we could always wonder how we're going to represent architecture. How do you photograph it? Chinois said that architecture was 50% of the building and 50% the way it was photographed. And in our case, very often, the buildings that we transform are sold very quickly, or they're rented very quickly, and we then lose access to them. So we have to improvise. We have to invent ways to ensure that they look as if they are warm places to live in without anybody actually living in them. We've tested a lot of things. As I said before, often in our buildings and renovations there are fewer and fewer furniture.
A common condition for us, which is not the traditional position of the architect, to design for no one. In a sense that many of the projects we design, they don't have a final user. I mean, they are They are coming out of either renovations or new buildings, and sometimes even houses that we are designing without knowing exactly who's the family that is going to live there, what are the routines, what are the ways how the space is going to be occupied, how are they going to have breakfast, how many times are they going to have dinner in the kitchen or in the living room. So, as a consequence of that, most of the discussions on representation are actually discussions on projections. How would we project ourselves into that space? And depending on who's working on a certain project, the collages themselves, they get a slightly different feeling on the way how the bed is closer to the kitchen or further away from the kitchen. I know this was Lara. I know that if the image has a lot of objects on the floor, this was not Anna. So I know that just by looking at the same collages that, and some people sometimes even assume, okay, this is all the same person doing it. No, it's not at all. But we know that there's a bit of, how do you say this, it's as if you get naked, as if we as individuals, not as the practice, the person, the individual clicking on the layers on Photoshop is somehow saying, this is how I would do it. This is my own projection on the space. So ironically, when we design houses where we know exactly who's the final client, we don't furnish the images, we don't need to. So it's a bit of, and we don't do it because we don't need to talk about that with the client, and we don't need to talk about it with ourselves because someone told us how they want it, so we don't need to prove it anymore. So it's kind of, it's a very interesting discussion because we many times, or I like to say always, work on domestic spaces. So the way how, and everyone understands domestic spaces. Many people might live a whole life without entering a museum or a painting or a church, but everyone lives somewhere. So that gives us a kind of common ground to comparison, discussion, and debate, I would say.
Oui, on va parler sur l'habité. Mais dans votre cas...
In your case, I think it's very different. You always build for a specific client. You build for somebody who is going to live in the building. You always build for someone. Look at this constructions within constructions. So it'd be interesting to talk about the person who is actually going to live in the construction. The person who lives in this space, for example, if he moves out and somebody else buys it, how do they live in it? Well, actually, we don't ever ask that. We tailor-make for each of our clients. We don't speculate as to what's going to happen afterwards or what's going to happen when it's sold. People who come to see us, they come to us because they have a very fixed idea in their minds of what they want. This is an apartment, actually, but a person is not going to have a house or an apartment designed. He's not going to do several in his lifetime. So we do something that is truly tailor-made. It's bespoke for them. We actually we wriggle our way into their private lives. We ask them intimate questions for their specifications. How do they live? What are their passions? We don't ask them how many rooms they want. In fact, we're not interested in rooms as architects. We're more interested in what a room is going to be used for. We will say, where do you write? Where do you listen to music? It's situations that interest us, and once they tell us situations, then we will actually set the stage for those situations. And sometimes we actually go far further than just what the academic function was intended to be. We have a great difference of opinion in the way in which we communicate our architecture. We have a production that talks about the element of space and not just the element of how you frame something. They have, or rather, we start with an opinion, a point of view, and we try to have a cinematographic view of something, a 360 view. We tell our clients what is happening a long way away from where they are, right up to very close to where they are. When we're communicating, when we're talking about a project, you're going to have a mock-up, you're going to have a prototype, you're going to have the narrative. It's a world that is cut up, if you like. I'm very wary of architecture that is actually limited to one particular square, one particular point of view. In competitions and in schools, they often say you have to build something in this limited space. But afterwards, sometimes when you actually go outside that space and you look around at what is around that, you're often very disappointed. So we try not to have things that are too clear-cut and square. And this up here was also something that was presented in the Biennale in Venise. It was bought by the FRAC in Orléans. It's a little loft, it's an apartment, it's by the seaside, and the whole idea was to use just one material. It was these little white slats, and this is a studio. It's the client is somebody who goes out early fishing, and then he has a siesta all afternoon. There's a little toilet, there's a tiny kitchen, and there's a bathroom. So we thought that the floor could be a mobile floor with these different slats that it's a bit like a Lucio Fontana drawing. So you see, our references are not always references of other architects. It's artistic. We can go and look at painters or music or television series or what we hear children saying when they come out of school. Our architecture is one that is one based on curiosity. Well, my passion is curiosity. When I go to a sports club, for example, I listen to what people say. They talk about their material. When I'm playing the drums, I like listening to what other people listen to, why they listen to things. So we try to concentrate on little things. Later on, I think you actually compare our production to a curiosity shop, a shop made up of nicks and knacks. And that's what we tried to do. Our architecture is curious. I don't like the word original. I hate it. Originality is not a subject that is worthy of architecture, but architecture is singular. It is curious. It corresponds to one particular situation, one particular economy, one particular environment. Well, the third image is how the people who live in it actually adopt it, but we will talk about that afterwards. But before that, we're more Roger Moore. That we're more 0-0 set. We love gadgets. Another thing, getting back to talk about the half pipe that we have here, but also your projects that are very different, as we can see, architectural installations. Installations are another way of being able to connect theory or abstract with what is practical. So I'd like to ask you things about how you work now. On the left you've got a picture of Avignon-Clouet and Fala on the right. How does this correlate to the half pipe that we have outside? Why did you do your own half pipes? We began by talking about the Nakajin Tower in Tokyo. On the right, this is an exhibition that we did for the Triennale in Lisbon. It was a portrait of the people that we did there and the buildings that were there when we visited. This entire exhibition is made of scaffolding, and the posters that you can see are actually hanging from the scaffolding, and the capsules are hanging from the scaffolding. What we wanted to do was to have a type of resonance, but everybody knows what scaffolding is. It's part of our daily points of reference. And we think that architecture is made up of daily points of reference as well, and we often use them. to express our works. We don't think really that it's possible to invent anything. A kitchen is a kitchen, a floor is a floor, a window is a window. So each time the question is, what is the best possible window or the best possible kitchen for this space? And what is our relation to that space? The half-pipe is a completely different kettle of fish. It's a different exercise. We thought that the request that you made of us was a somewhat strange one. So we wanted to make it as domestic as possible, so that it would be a sounding board between the objects there and the image of the half-pipe.
In a certain extent, this example on the wall is an homage, is a respectful proposal. Although it feels very aggressive as an image, it's actually trying to respect as far as possible the goal of the exhibition and the object being exhibited, which is not the exhibition itself, it's the nakajin. And here it's the opposite. It's a very aggressive reaction to a very strange geometry, to this idea that we design half without knowing what happens on the other half, to a certain, let's say, this is more of explosion of flavors, and this is more of an homage than anything else.
Et dans vos cas, l'expérience de...
And what about you two? What do you think about this installation, half-pipe? Well, for us, it was something new. We were interested in the context. In fact, the picture there, you've got the French pavilion in the Biennale in Venice in 2002, in Venice in 2002. And we did the same thing for the half-pipe here. The half-pipe was a site. It was as if we were walking into a site. For us, there's no subject that is noble or not noble. We can begin a project with a pun, with a wordplay. Again, it has to be fun, or it might just be looking at something ironically. We don't catalogue things. We don't catalogue who we are, and then we put on the architect's clothes and suits with a Cartesian outlook of things. We're not interested in doing that. What we're interested in is to find a subject, maybe a subject that you're going to be able, that's going to be very powerful, that you're going to be able to infuse momentum into with just a word or a pun. And that's why I often talk about culture of mosaics as opposed to the culture of moisture or mold. I often talk about that with my students. We were in a very humid context here in Venice, and we were asked to present our little babies. So we put these little maternity cribs. They were built not far from us, and we put our little babies in these cribs. And they are waterproof, because with the rising of the water in Venice, you never know. And one of the requests was to come up with a sample of a building that we had already designed. And we had actually worked in one of the chateaux in the Loire Valley, which is called Chaumont. They have a horticultural fair there every year. And we had decided to actually contaminate the whole of the pavilion in Chaumont. We contaminated it with mold. And we've done the same thing with the half-pipe. The constraint of this half-pipe, Francis said to us, don't damage it, because every 3 months we have to use it again. And we immediately replied, we want to attack it, we want to destroy it. It's a bit just like a game. I don't know if you ever saw the French film Ridicule, The Ridiculous. It's something where one of the games is one of the games that they play is they actually have to dominate the other simply through their prose, through the language they speak. They have to be witty and amusing and clever. And that's what we wanted to do in this half-pipe. Once again, we can't we cannot remain neutral, of course. There's been a lot of improvisation as well, but this is deliberate, and this saw is deliberate. We want to attack this half pipe. This is a huge saw. It is a saw that can only be handled by 2 people, so there are the 2 people of our agency, and it was also an open hand to Fala. If they could take one side of the saw, and we'd take the other, and we'd cut the wretched thing in 2. So at the same time, you've got the saw that is balanced. It's very fragile. It's a metaphor. It shows the way in which we design a project. We are always walking the very fine line for stability, and I think that Fala does exactly the same thing. We are always halfway between balance and imbalance, and the slightest thing can collapse this house of cards, and that's what interested us here. And then, of course, you've got the mice, who are the actual handles of the saw. Well, that's our logo. Our logo is divided into 2. We also have a subtitle for our agency, which is the mouse and the hammer. The mouse is intuition, and the hammer is the cleverness of the handyman. And the teeth of the saw could be the skyline of some of the projects that we have been able to do over the last 20 years. As if for each situation, we actually sawed a site and injected it with our projects. It's something physical. We like this rapport with the material that we work with, and we like to truly imbibe ourselves with this material. We like to get down and dirty, as it were, when it comes to materials.
Quelque chose à ajouter, c'est très différent, non? La façon de... Non, surtout sur le half pipe.
Got anything to add on the half pipe? Well, we're talking about action-reaction. I think in both cases it is a reaction. We found that the object was a little minimalist. It was a little terrifying to start with because it was so stark. It was minimalist. It's another type of violence. In both cases, both of our proposals are violent.
So 2 projects here for houses, for clients. And here you can see that you have here your own installation between 2 clients. So you've already started to speak about the importance of the client, the person that might live there, that you might not know in the first place, but who will live there, and also the topic of appropriation by the user. What could you say about it? Well, actually, this is the very first project, or maybe the second or third project, which we completed for a client that we knew was going to live there. And so it was very often. We already had this house in ruins. It was in a terrible state, and to start with. And the only thing that we knew was that we had to keep the volume as is, and the budget was extremely tight. And so we thought that we would do a space. Here we are between the living room and the dining room. So that space would take all of the available space in terms of height, length, and width. So a bit of a 3D expansion, making the space look much bigger than what it actually is. So we have this curve here with 3 or 4 doors, I believe, leading to all the other spaces with a bathroom, a bedroom, a mezzanine, and the entrance. So that space was to be as simple as possible. But what about the furniture, the table, the chairs? Everything is perfectly set into place. Well, this is the furniture of the person who lives there.
What I said before, there was someone that told us exactly how she's going to live, how she's going to occupy. It's a single woman with no kids, so she told us exactly her routines. Everything was very crafted in that sense. So for us, it was kind of a funny experiment for a change. And as such, the space became both. It's a very small house that we try to glorify in its scale by, a certain set of small tricks that make the space a bit more generous. And more important, it's a very wide house that somehow gives a bit of this musification feeling to every single piece, to every single plant, to every book, etc. So the projection of the occupation in this case was very relieving for us because it was very much in line with what we could have dreamed of before. And we tried in a way to somehow subvert the usual exercise. So now that we know what happens, let's see how it is occupied, and it was occupied as we imagined it could have been. So it's like the egg and the chicken, and it worked out quite well. We were very happy with this. It's the cheapest house ever, but it was.
Alors vous êtes retourné et ça reste comme ça.
Well.
Comment?
Now you've been back. I would imagine that you've gone back to that place, but does it actually look like the way that you had imagined and envisioned it? That first idea. How did it pan out in the end with regards to space, etc.?
Next question than that, because this house, and I need to put numbers. The house costed 50,000 euros to build, and there was someone from the other side of the world that saw it in a magazine and came to Portugal and bought it for 5 times that price. So now there's a completely different person with a completely different furniture, with a completely different...
So this is the context in which we operate. So even when we have a final client, somehow what is happening now with real estate in Porto makes that final client is not a final client in the end because there's more money by just selling and buying something else.
Oui, mais en tout cas, ça c'est important pour vous, non?
No, because when we are asked to do something for someone, we just do that. But of course, let's put it like this: the question of should an apartment be absolutely tailor-made for someone or not? I mean, for me, a good space is a good space. That's it.
But to answer your question, just to come back a bit. During the 7-8 months our client was there, I visited the house a couple of times, and she was really excited with the house. And the house was pretty much used the same way. There was a new table, there was maybe the cabinet that moved places because she was having trouble because of the curve, how exactly to put the furniture around. But it was pretty much the same idea of living, very sparsely populated corners and a very occupied center, like the inverse of a donut. But at the same time, when she finished the sale and when she sold the house, she designed a completely different house without us. So maybe she was the one unhappy. We were happy and she was unhappy. Who knows?
Pour vous, on voit pas dans ce cas le mobilier, on pourrait dire.
And in this case, you can't see any furniture. Is that something that's important for you, furniture? Or do you just have a space and then it's up to the person who lives in it who's going to transform it? Well, it depends. Are you asking as to how they actually appropriate something, adopt it for themselves? Well, we try to be as precise as possible. We talked about the spatial aspect, the different aspects inside and interior. And because everything is extremely designed, we, as architects, step into the shoes of the future users as much as possible, which means that afterwards, of course, it's a bit like shoes. The client just slips into these shoes. And that is something that is very easy for us. Not all the time. Sometimes people are going to live in a house the way they like to live in it, so they'll have different furniture, and that's normal. What happened was we asked clients whether they had any family furniture at the beginning, so that we could actually integrate it into our design right from the beginning. But we're even cheekier than that. Sometimes when they actually bring their furniture, they say, oh, well, damn, it actually doesn't fit into this at all, and they sell their furniture and buy something else. Coming back to the penthouse on the Loire, there was a Gauss Benetti piece of furniture, and we highlighted it as if it were in a museum. We showcased it. It was on a plinth and so forth. I mean, it could be anything. It could be some type of armoire or cupboard. We have to find the right place to it. And yes, sometimes we do build around articles or furniture, and we create conditions so that these different elements can have an added value. We don't use color because we believe that color comes from light. So we create the conditions for the best possible light so that the light brings in the color with reflections and so forth. But afterwards, if you have a book on a table or a sock that's lying on the floor, that too is a slice of life. It is a material, it is a color, and it will give a value added to the space. We're precise, but we're not authoritarian. And behind these pictures, you have the actual building, the construction. Is that you? Oh, that's us. Oh, no, it is us. Yes, it is us. I didn't even recognize my own project. No, that's Fala. But it's to talk about craftsmanship, traditional construction on the one hand, or using prefabrications. We have seen that it's often the final result is going to depend on the people who are working on the construction site.
Not propaganda. One, we stopped drawing at scale 125. We don't go further than that because there's no point. The contractors we work with, the budgets we have, the clients we work with, it makes no sense to go further than that. And there's a certain handmade feeling in the way how most of the decisions are actually made on site. So from that scale onwards, it's going there and then checking how much money we still have, what can we do, if we sacrifice this, we can get money for that. So there's a bit of, how can I call it, performance in a way. There's a bit of gut feeling in many details. There's of course an execution project. There's something that we believe to be the plan, but it's a lot about that, and we are lucky to have very good people in different fields, mostly carpentry, working with metal, masonry. We have very good. We have the people that apply the marble in our buildings. They have like 75-year-olds, and when they die, the knowledge is going to die with them. So we are lucky enough to have the opportunity to collaborate with these people and to learn a bit from them. But it's true that there's a bit of there's an ambition of detailing, design, craftsmanship. But there's also a reality that many times, in our case, it's not possible to go as deep as we would like to. As a consequence, our architecture became, I wouldn't call it simplistic, but simplified. You know, there's, well, we do execution projects faster because we don't do those drawings. We don't need to. So, and then on site,
Well, to be clear, our 1 to 25 drawings have the amount of detail that they could almost be 1 to 10. But yes, but I think in a way it changed a bit the kind of architecture. I mean, our architecture is molded a bit by that also. And so our architecture has to be a bit poppier and a bit stronger.
Ça, c'est parce que c'est possible de le faire en...
That's because it's possible to do it in Portugal, in Porto. You have people who are still there. You still have craftsmen. But there are some countries where it's just impossible. In Nantes, for example, I don't know whether it is still possible to work with true craftsmen. It's going to depend as well on the scale. It's going to depend on whether it's a transformation or not. One of the reasons why we have to adapt everything on site is often because it's a question of renovation. Well, Just as an aside, I'm getting back to the role of the architect. There are a lot of architects today who refuse to actually supervise their work sites. I suppose you do, and we do as well. So we're very demanding. We start at the beginning and we end at the end. We start at the beginning of putting pencil to paper, and we end with the perfect execution of what we imagined and what we built for our clients. We're very demanding like that. We like to work with craftsmen as well. When we're on site, we can influence situations, even on some of the bigger work sites. The fact that you're there on site very often, that you know the people who are working there, means that you can negotiate certain things which weren't necessarily written in black and white in the description of the project, simply because you build up a relationship of trust and because you adopt the building. It becomes yours. It doesn't just become the building of the owners or of the clients, but even the workers who are working on it, they too enjoy going to work, and they thank the architects for being there so often and for imbuing in them or reactivating a certain savoir-faire that they have, and that is the beauty of the whole thing. So we're very similar to Fala when you talk about craftsmanship. The only project that we did not follow the execution of was this one here. I think we can move on talking about how the architect communicates. This is something that's very visible in your work as well. Here are some photos that you gave us tonight. These are images that we can see. But if we take a look at your website as well, in both cases, on the left you've got Avignon-Clouet. They use the word subjects, and then they've got the nouns and the verbs. Whereas in Fala, you have projects, you have images. These are we can actually travel through your projects. And the connection, you can see the connection of the projects. They're not all up there, of course. There are a lot more on the website, but it's another way of actually communicating. So you can see this as well in the way in which you have done collages in both cases. These are images that I chose, and we were talking about this earlier. Do you do these collages yourself? And also, you said that you draw to a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 25, but when you actually present the plans, they're linear. You've got lines. There's a big difference in your designs. There's a difference in your execution and your construction, but there's a difference in your designs as well. So, you both have different ways of communicating with the public. Was this a deliberate decision, and how important is communication for you?
This is a very long question.
Yeah, and we don't have that much time.
So I'm going to try to give a short answer. So first slide, this one, it's a lot about how we see the work. We see the work both as a series of islands. Each project has its own reality. It has its own client, momentum, site, budget, constraints, etc. But all of them, they were done by the same people. So they end up sharing a series of themes, a series of tropes that are common between all of them. And this is not planned. We are not thinking like we need to do this on this project so that it matches that project. It just happens very naturally. And a posteriori, we remove these relations. That's why we like to divide the project in the website, for example, the first layer of projects and a second layer of connections between projects. And this brings us to the second slide. That is, the representation. We discussed it before. Many times we operate within given canvases, refurbishing of buildings. Other times we invent, let's say, new buildings. But the point is always there's a certain promise, and the projection of collage or any 3D image. We also do 3D images, we also do models, we also do line sketches and whatever. It's about trying to communicate something. It's about saying something to us when we discuss it, and to say something to someone we are presenting the project to.
I think it's important to know that, I mean, for us, the first reason why we started doing collages was that we had very little time to do a competition image, and that was the first one, was done a bit like this, because it was easier. But then we realized actually that it had an influence on the way we design and on the way we do architecture, and also it was less deceiving in a way, because I think it's clearly not reality. And it allows to have that moment when the project is really a project, so something in the future that is clearly not real, and a moment when
it's a promise.
Yeah, and I think it's also important in our process to discuss with clients, because at that moment the question is not, what the model of the handle of the doors, but it's something else. It's something that is more about space in a way, and so in a way, this escape from reality as first is important to tackle reality later. We thought
it gives us a margin of error.
And what was? Yeah.
It gives us a margin of error because it's not fully defined. It's like it's everything there. So a 4-year-old can understand the image, but it's not telling you everything at the same time. So if you only draw to 1 to 25, when you go on site, you can do 1 to 10, 1 to 5, 1 to 2. So you can somehow zoom in later.
And this was, I mean, we first also here started doing these drawings because most of our projects are renovations, and in a way, a lot of our projects are, let's say, what is old and what is new in these projects. We try to blur that, and we try to make everything like the finished product should be one in a way. And so that's the reason why we started doing these drawings like this. And
they just represent space. They just represent the architectural hierarchy. They don't. Most of the times our construction is not that good. I mean, it's not because we don't know how to do it better, it's just because there's no condition to do so. So as a consequence, we end up focusing on what truly matters on a certain project, the way how the plan has a certain tension between the circulation and the living room, the proportion of the room. So it's a very accurate drawing, but it just removes all the expression of construction. So it doesn't really matter to us if it's a brick wall, a plaster wall, a gypsum board wall. It's a wall. It's a wide surface that separates the side A from the side B. That's what these drawings show. We have the constructive drawings, we have the other information, but it doesn't feel, when we communicate the project, necessary to be talking about it. It's not, well, in a way we are not super proud of them because, as I said before, they are not amazing. But it's, at the same time, and even more, it's because the information we want to emphasize, and that's what this drawing does. It's emphasizing the part that matters the most to us, which is the architectural hierarchy of spaces and proportions and so on.
Et pour vous, la communication?
And what about communication for you? It's different, but I think it's also very interesting to see exactly how you organize your work around communication. Well, already on the portrait, we put a strategy. It's relatively simple. When we began in 2000, we decided that we weren't specifically beautiful to look at, we weren't very photogenic, and that what was interesting in our work as an architect was not us as people. And you can see other companies where they actually put the architect in the forefront, and we decided that we would put the architecture in the forefront. So it's true that often, it's not that we hide away, but there is no reason why we should be putting ourselves in the front line. What is interesting and what people are interested in is the architect. You know, if you're a drummer or a soccer player, people see you, but people don't care about the architects. They care about the architecture. And that's why we have this type of... We cover ourselves up simply so that you can't see our faces. Now, for the internet site, it's true that each project is a subject. It's a noun, if you like. All of our projects have names that are a bit like fables. And we have the house of gypsum, or the house of dry board, or whatever. We always have somebody, when we're developing a project, we have a counterpart in front of us, and they have a name, and they have a surname, so we try to define exactly what they want. When you are communicating with a client, you give a name to the project, and the client is sitting around the table. He is a privileged partner in the project. And us, afterwards, in representation, this is just one extract of representation. When we communicate, it's quite possible that you might have a prototype scale 1 built by ourselves over the weekend just to show a client what it's going to look like in real life. If we are building a wall, then the wall has a certain materiality. And I think we also have a way of designing that is not academic. We don't begin by the drawing. We might begin a project by simply looking at one little technical detail, a wall, or one brick, or one bolt. And it's from that brick or wall or bolt that the entire rest of the construction will be done. So there is no point of entry, one single point of entry into a project. You can start a project from anywhere. When you start a project, you are totally free, and you have to grasp that freedom. We don't have any protocol. And that's what's very difficult when you're trying to teach architecture, is that you don't have to start by going to the site, taking photographs, and then you draw a little square, and then that square becomes 3D, and then it becomes a plan, a design, and then you suddenly put texture on top of it. That's just an academic reflex that you're taught in schools today. We don't agree with that. It all has to start with a point of view. It has to start with a vision, taking note of something, and then you will have to use your intuition. Intuition is really important, and the experience that architects has is that they can actually fine-tune their intuition based on experience. The fact that we have done several exercises time and time again, our intuition today is very fine-tuned. We have honed it, and we can actually find the precious core of something. Before, you had a great block of all sorts of possibilities, whereas now you have just the precious core of something. So when we see our clients, after we have tried to understand what it is they want, then we go and isolate ourselves for a month or for 6 weeks. We don't communicate with them, and when they come back to us, we put before them a project that is almost entirely finished. We don't put a tiny little sketch and then we suggest that it's going to be on this property or something. No, we actually give them a project that has a name, that has details, because we have to be convinced in the project if we want to properly communicate with them. We will already have eliminated everything that we can possibly eliminate, and we will say, look, we thought of all sorts of different ideas. This is the one that has stuck with us, and normally, in 95% of cases, it is the one that the client will go with. They will join us in the adventure, and it will be a joint adventure between them and us. And in your case, do you do that as well? You have the client who comes to see you and the project is already almost finished? Oh no, it would be great if it were like that, but it's not like that. Most of our clients actually don't know that we're called Fala. They know our first names, and they have absolutely they really don't want to have to deal with an architect. For them, an architect is a problem. And it's a problem, however, which is a legal necessity. So a lot of the efforts that we have to make is in defending the idea that they need a project. So if we were to end up with a finished project, it just wouldn't work.
You know, we have normal clients, you know, clients that tell us what they want, and they have an expectation on the work with us. That represent a very small minority. We have clients that understand what we do, but are not going to live on the project, so they give us different degrees of freedom, and they have different degrees of expectation. But we have what I would call more than half of the clients that literally have zero understanding or expectation or ambition to work with us. We were just, you know, the first name on the phone list, or usually we end up working with these clients for the most random reasons. And these are usually clients with very little expectation in terms of budget, site constraints, etc. So they just want something to be done for tomorrow. Like the house we saw before, it was just this lady that had so little money that we were the only ones that accepted to do the project, that thought it was possible to do so. So as a consequence, this ends up molding a lot the way how the relationship goes, because I always make the joke that a secret for a happy life is low expectations. So if we have this as a starting point, we can only benefit from here. So many of our projects start by us being yes people. So we are yes men. We say yes all the time. We take challenges that usually we shouldn't take. But then when we take them, it's about understanding, okay, now we are in. So what do we do with it? And those 50% of the projects many times becomes extremely funny. It's very challenging and many times very complex, but very funny because they are opportunities that normal clients wouldn't take. So the result will not be normal architecture, it would be something else.
So if there is a project, it's absolutely unwanted, unsolicited, in a way, which is, I mean, in most cases, it's for the greater good, I believe. But, you know,
and this brings us the discussion of communication in a completely different level, which is the way how we talk between us is very different from the way how we talk with our collaborators, which is even more different from the way how we talk with the municipal agents, which is completely different from the way how we talk with clients. So the words we use, and depends on the client naturally, because there are clients and clients, but the words we use to describe a project to the municipality are ambiguous because we don't want problems. The words we use to talk with ourselves are usually very insulting and, you know, very aggressive. And many times when we talk with clients, mostly these 50% of the clients, we say words like, it's going to be beautiful. No. Because it's what they want to hear. They don't want to talk about Palladio. No one wants to discuss Palladio while designing a bathroom, but we do. So we talk about Palladio in the bathroom on our own, and we talk about Pinterest pinboards with the clients on their time. So to a certain extent, as Ahmed said, we have to lie or disguise ourselves for a greater good.
For the greater good.
No, but you know what I mean. You know.
C'est la même chose pour vous. Comment travaillez-vous avec les clients?
And is it the same for you? How do you work with your clients? Now, we don't have much time left. Maybe just one or two quick questions? People who come to see us don't simply stumble across us. Well, you're very lucky then. Most of the time, they know why they have come to see us. They know what they're looking for, because we have a past. We have built things that they've seen, that they're very attracted to, that they like. And it's a certain category of clientele that we have. We have a very wide-ranging clientele, but they come to us because they want us to work for them. And we ask them to give us the specifications. We talk to them, we interrogate them almost, and and then we step back from them and we say, well, now we're going to go away for 6 weeks. And then we come back, as Benjamin said, we come back with a project that is relatively finalized, so that we have something that we can get our teeth into, that we can discuss. There are certain strategic aspects to this as well, but it means that they can really see the project, and then we can defend our idea. We're always very sure of what we propose. and they are going to be much more attracted by something that is finished than something that is not. We try to carry people away by the force of our conviction. We talk to them in a language that they can understand. We show them, we give them a demonstration as if it's taken for granted that that's the only way that it could be. And I admire you if you manage to adapt your language to every single person you have in front of you. When you're in front of a jury, you have as many people as decisions that are going to be made. We come back to our client and say, well, look, this is why we opted for this. This is why we chose this. We tell them in easy terms, not too technical terms, why we have done this, and then we try to convince them and to carry them along with us. We hope that they're going to be convinced, but we don't try to sell our souls simply to convince them. It's the project, and we believe in the project and that the project will seduce them. I think often the project is actually much more than what they were expecting. You know, when they tell you what their specifications are, they say, I want a bedroom, I want a kitchen, I want a toilet. It's very basic. But earlier we talked about the swimming pool. We simply hinted that it might be possible to have a swimming pool. And it was those elements that one just hints at that afterwards actually become the crux of the whole project. It's paradoxical for them because when we come back with a project, it completely changes what their initial demand was, what their initial desire was. Now, we don't accept all orders either. That we would refuse somebody who comes to us and says, I want you to build me this. And we say, well, if you already know what you want, you don't need an architect. So we have a lot of clients who know nothing about architecture. Sometimes they've stumbled across us as well. But when we meet with them for the first time, they're curious. We sense that they want our insight. And often when people come to an architect, it's because they are looking for us to fill in the things that they don't have. If they knew what they wanted, they wouldn't need an architect. And a client who comes to us and says, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, we say, thank you very much, turn around, the door's behind you. Maybe that is why you sometimes say that your architecture is one of insolence, and you, Fala, you say it is naive architecture, but unfortunately we don't have enough time for this now. We have time maybe for one question from the public, and then we'll go outside and you can continue outside. Does anybody have one question that they would like to ask? With a microphone, please. With a microphone, please. You talk a lot about the relation to the final user. And what I was wondering was, what happens if you're dealing with collective living? You don't have one single final user. So you can't just actually have an influence on one person's lifestyle if you're talking about flats. Well, we were working in the 7th district, the 7th arrondissement of Paris, and we were actually chosen for that because we had so much experience in individual projects, individual housing, that we were able to actually project that into collective housing. I don't know if you've seen the Rue Rivière project, but it was a whole lot of houses, the one next to the other. There were very strict specifications. You had the night, the day side, and we had things that had to be respected, and we didn't. We destructured these apartments to make sure that there was one comfortable part and one technical one. And it was because we were so experienced in individual housing that we were able to do this collective housing. The actual design in this project is something that starts not just with the building, but it's going to start when the person leaves their office, when they walk along the road into their building. when they finally get to their building and when they sit down in their building. And that's the same for an individual as it is for collective housing. So yes, in that case, you don't have one final user, but we have so much experience in individual situations that we were able to put that to good use for collective housing. And I think that for collective housing, we work two ways. It's not just on the scale of the road, but also, or the building, but also we work on the scale of the inhabitant. And sometimes the way in which the inside of a building is designed might alter the outside of the building and vice versa.
Oui, vous avez parlé beaucoup de langage.
You've also talked a lot about language, abbreviations. There's a lot of references, architectural references, your own references, and you've also talked about Esperanto architecture as being the common language, but you haven't actually talked about drawing. Is it because drawing is just the written word of your Esperanto?
En fait, oui, non, il n'y a pas de question qui.
Well, I've shown a few things. What do you mean exactly by sketching? When it comes to hand drawing, we're no fetishists. All our sketches usually just end up in the bin. It's just a way for us to communicate amongst ourselves, and that is it. But a line that might turn into a wall, that would definitely be a very important topic for us. So I guess it's not really the drawing that will interest us, but what it will lead to. Well, it's just a matter of generations. I guess you are 10 years younger than your neighbors. In what was described by Avignon in terms of representation, 3D views, I could that really echoed in me with regards to what I might have heard when I was in college. So that's the type of academic content that I might have had when I was still studying. We feel that we design in 2D, and the third dimension happens when we reach that grand finale stage. So there's that tension always between our 2D way of thinking and 3D, but everything we do is tried and tested with models, etc. And we also do quite a good bit of render in order to test things and check things, but then it all ends up in the bin. But you are part of a tradition in a way. Point Suprême in Athens, for example, there are new teams, and you are no strangers to this. So it goes, beyond that whole question of it just being a tool. It's a way of positioning yourself with regards to architecture. I totally agree with you. We can only ever feel that we master something if we start with that 2D thinking. I don't really feel that you could think in 3D. As far as we're concerned, it was a bit of a discovery when we ended our studies. It was something that was very exciting about it, something that really elicited our interest. Did you do architecture straight away with yours when you started your studies, or did you study something else before? No, I studied architecture straight away. Filipe, I believe, did a bit of graphics before.
In graphic design. It's different from doing a bit of graphics. No, I don't know if I fully understood the first question, but to try to answer it, if there's a thing we do more than anything else, is to sketch by hand. But I mean, in a normal day, I can trash 4, 5, 6 A4 pages, printed on the two sides and just with sketches. Because I mean, I come from Porto, the Porto school, and this is just a tradition there. But the sketches we do are much more schematic, diagrammatic, are drawings that are somehow a kind of, let's say, bidimensional translation of some communication we are having. But we do, in a normal day, I would say 50 to 100 3D images, renders, print screens, that we don't show also. Each plan comes out of, I don't know, hundreds of options of plan before. And each collage is actually done on the first day and keeps evolving as the project evolves. And the one we decide to publish is let's define. But it's to be said, there's a way to use the tools. Regardless of that, what is truly the most important thing for us is that all of these tools, they are a means to an end, and the end is the project itself. That's why, for example, when we were invited to this installation, and we were seeing previous exhibitions with other installations, we saw many offices, for example, doing something where they were showing ongoing work or models or, promises. And we decided as a kind of statement to bring just finished projects and to put them in relation, like not to really explain what we are trying to do there, just putting them together and trying to, we hope, generate relations that people that visit the exhibition and see them would understand. And even in the last minute, because there was a miscommunication and we didn't understand, we had to do a video for the TV. So we did it very, very quickly in the last 48 hours. We felt like, okay, let's press the button again. Let's put images in pairs and let's just force this idea that we like to believe exists, that the work is interconnected and so on. So we could talk about tools for a long time, and we as architects, we love to talk about it, but in the end, I think what really matters, or what stays, what survives, what surpasses the test of time is the architecture itself. And all of these, they just help to inform, to deliberate, to somehow define the architecture itself. So if the best tool to eat pasta is a fork or a spoon or a Chinese chopsticks, I don't know. But if somehow it has an impact, so as Ahmed many times says in the office, the tool is only relevant if it actually helps to define the architecture itself. If we are just doing collages like OMA 1978 because we want to style our website, I mean, what's the point? So we do the things we do because they inform and they help the production. Yep. And in the end, there's this kind of glorification of some pieces, like the collages and so on, mostly by students more than anyone else. But that's not the point at all. What really matters is the architecture per se as the final object.
Saweta, Benjamin, Ahmed, Luis, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much to all of you, and I think that we can continue this conversation outside. Thank you.